Hello and welcome to the Smooth Scaling podcast, where we talk with industry experts to uncover how to design, build, and run stable, scalable, and resilient systems with ultimately the goal of providing great user experiences. I'm your host, José Quaresma, and today with me I have Yam Shal-Bar, the CTO at RadView, and we'll be talking about load testing and how to prepare for peak demand. We discuss, among other things, what are the usual suspects from in the bottlenecks and in Yam's experience, and we also touch upon the impact of AI in load testing. Welcome, Yam. Welcome to the Smooth Scaling podcast.
Thank you. So nice to be here. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to have you. So, could we start a little bit by you telling us a little bit about yourself and also about RadView?
Yeah, sure. So RadView has been around for many years, for almost 30-some years in the business of load testing. So that's what we do. And I've been there for almost 20 years now. Almost, next year it's going to be 20. So we do load testing. This is our focus. We have our product WebLoad, which stimulates the user behavior and then scale it under load. And we measure the behavior of your system, and we help you find the bottlenecks and make it run smoother.
And were you always working in this? You said you've been 20 years at RadView. Were you always in this space also before that, or?
No. Actually, okay. I moved. This was new space, so I was always in software development for different things, but I worked in different places in the world. I lived in India. I lived in London. Yeah, so I've been around, but load testing was new for me in RadView.
And it sounds like it was a good move for you. You said it's almost up to 20 years, and congratulations for that, by the way. So could you? And you mentioned simulating kind of actual user journeys. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of how do you do that? How does a customer do that using WebLoad?
Sure, yeah. So like every good thing, you start with planning. So the first step is, you need to plan. You need to try to map out what are your users are going to do. I guess there is always a difference between actual system that is running in production and you can see what it's doing. But sometimes our users are planning to start a new application that nobody ever used. So that's a different type of challenge. You need to guess what it's doing, but it's still the same. You need to gather whatever information you have, either from what you have or from similar sources, similar website, what it's going to be look like, and you want to map up the journeys that your users are doing. So that's the basics, and then you drill down into creating scripts for each one of these journeys. I usually prefer or recommend you to start small, so don't jump ahead and try to make your best assumption of how everybody's going to do it at the same time, like 20 different scripts. And people have the tendency to do it because they said this is the most realistic. And they're right. I do recommend this would be your last test. But for the first test, just take the first, most common scenario and see how it works, because it's just so much easier to read understand the statistics that way. When you have one simple scenario, the behavior is pretty expected, and when it's not, you can say, oh, this graph is not supposed to do that. But when you run 20 different things at the same time, maybe that's predictable, maybe that's okay that this is what's happening. So that's why I recommend to start simple, and then start with a simple script, test another simple script, and eventually do the bigger one that you combine them.
Okay. And is that so? When, of course, we at Qt, we are big fans of load testing and performance testing. We do have a lot of customers that the focus is on kind of peaks, right, and kind of sudden surges in traffic. Is there anything specific in the way to approach that from a kind of from a load test perspective?
Yeah, so it could be. So it really depends on how your application works. Some applications they build pressure, so you can test it how I'm going from one user to two user to more.
Mm.
And some applications, just by their nature, they have this burst. So a good example for us is universities. Many universities, they have the registration on specific date. They have on this date, 9 a.m.
Mm.
Everybody can register for their courses.
Yeah.
And everybody wants to get the best course. So 9 a.m. sharp, bam, everybody
Yeah.
jumps into. So that's usually a much bigger peak than you're talking. Yeah. So, and that does require special treatment in the load testing. So for these guys, we usually recommend to have special um, to model your script the same way. So we start off user are kind of logging into the system over some time, and then they wait for this 9 a.m. and then they all bam start to fire.
Yeah.
And that kind of tries to stimulate this behavior of many users hitting at the same time. Yes.
And in your experience, and you've been doing this for quite some time now, are there any specific areas, types of infrastructure components, types of scenarios that are more often the bottlenecks when you see kind of customers starting to do the load tests?
Yeah, so you have the usual suspects. So databases are notorious to being a problem, and specifically locks. If you're trying to do something that most of the other components are easier to scale, but some of them are inevitably they're gonna, all right, I want this course, you want this course, only one of them can take it, so there's gonna be locking. So that's the usual suspect. But I think part of what we're doing and the reason that we're doing is that you never know, which is an interesting thing.
Yeah.
We've seen customers that they're saying, "Oh, I want this website to support 5,000 customers." They get blocked at 5, so they think they're gonna get to 5,000, but the first 5, that's it. It's already they didn't think about something that causes it to block, and that's why you want to test. Yeah. So yeah, I think. Yeah, and I also really like what you guys are doing because so there is this notion of planning. Okay, so we plan for the best. We try to know what our limits, but every system has a limit, and sometimes you get caught and you're unexpected. You have more volume that you anticipate, and then having a user experience which is not just okay, the system is crashing by. So have some kind of a system to say, all right, there is a queue that's going to let you in. I think that's a really brilliant approach. And again, because no matter what you do, you're going to have a limit at some point.
Yeah.
And for most companies, it's a good thing to have too many customers coming to their website and say, yeah, it's all right. But if it does happen, you probably want them to have a good experience rather than some 5 or 3 hour system down. Yeah.
Well, I very much agree with that, but of course, I'm also biased, right? But it was a little bit. We did have Martin Jensen, our head of engineering, in one other episode here in the podcast as well, and this was one of the things that we were talking about. It was exactly kind of scaling and how that complements or can be complemented with the virtual waiting room, because you can scale, but at least you can scale some components. Then it, of course, varies a lot on can you scale all the components that are required in a user journey. We're talking about kind of the bottlenecks, as you mentioned, database being the most one of the most famous culprits from that perspective. So yeah, very
sure. And also, you're right that the flip side of the coin is just like if you say I have load testing, I don't need to have to worry about anything else. I think the flip side of the coin is also true. If you have a queue, you should also load test because you don't want to reach that unnecessarily. You don't want these 5,000 users. You don't want the first 5 to go in and the rest of them just waiting in line. So you don't want to optimize your system before. And so you do load testing, you optimize your system to the max, and then you can kind of rely on your backup plan if that one didn't work.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a best of both worlds.
we see that quite often as well, right? And we then can often work with our customers also on kind of getting to this, I guess, number on what should kind of the capacity, what should the flow, right? So how many users per minute do you want to let into your website? And sometimes there's a infrastructure technical constraint. Sometimes it's more of an inventory constraint for that, right? But maybe going back to the infrastructure constraint, how, I mean, do you have a specific way to define or to get to the capacity of a web application? I mean, how do you help your customers getting to that capacity number? And I don't know if that's in kind of concurrent users in the website. So kind of how do you think about that? It would be very interesting to hear.
Yeah, so this is a very good question. I think it's also a matter of terminology, and this is something that it's good to think as a customer. You need to think about, because these numbers they represent the same thing. But how much can I support? We have
Mm,
so many different numbers that we use across the industry. Then it's important to know that they're not the same. So uh, if you say my website supports 100,000 users, maybe that's over a
mm.
day, which is completely different than 100,000 users concurrently running, which is going to be in
Yeah.
the million. So there is a big difference in throughput if they're
Mm,
all doing something or not. So all these small changes make a big difference. So when you do, I don't really have there is no rule of the thumb to convert from one to another,
yeah.
but just when you think about it, you need to think, am I comparing the same things? So I think, and and for different reasons, you do need different measurements. So load testing, we usually talk about concurrent users. That's kind of our industry
Mm,
language, but you can't really easily convert it into throughput of how many users can I enter a minute, which is not the same as throughput in, megabytes per second that my
yeah.
website is going to support. You do need all these answers, by the way.
Mm,
So your network guy is gonna ask you, I don't know how many users. I don't care about users. I
mm.
just want to know how big the
Yeah.
bandwidth I need. And so the queue would be more interested about. But you do. It is possible to infer one from the other. So we
Mm,
start with virtual users, but we would show you the throughput. We would show you this is the users, but you'll see a graph of that's how much network they used.
yeah.
And if you know how long is your journey, which is very important, it's a key
Yeah.
thing. Yeah. So every new user is gonna come, but then is it staying for a minute or
Mm,
for half an
yeah.
hour? Some of our customers, they have this very short, you look at the website, you see something, you close it. And some of them, they're insurance companies. They are notorious. You can have
That's
really like an hour long the scenario. So a single user comes in and he kind of grabs the resources for a full hour.
mm,
So so it's definitely
yeah.
I think the important takeaway is that it's something that you need to know that there are different metrics to use across
Yeah.
and you need
Yeah.
to think about it. Yeah.
And it's definitely, at least to my knowledge and in my experience, it's not always easy to translate from one to the other. But I think, as you're saying, it is very important to know that you're not talking about the same thing, right? So I think one of
Yeah.
the
So we
things
don't have
where,
a solution for you guys. We don't say that's how many users that's going to
yeah,
translate to this many users per minute, but we do say don't assume that the number I
yeah,
have 100 users in my database, I have 100 concurrent users, I have 100, and I want to get 100 users flowing into the systems. They are all different numbers, so at
yeah,
least be aware that you need to think about the conversion and
yeah,
use some estimates, guesstimates, whatever you
yeah.
can to get to the number. But yeah.
And that's a little bit what we do when having the initial discussions with customers, right? Is to talk about, okay, so one thing is the number of users, but then it's also what is the average journey time for the
Oh,
user
yeah.
in your website, right? And then
Yeah.
from those, then then it's always an estimate, right? Maybe you or if you're lucky, you have data on it, right? But then you kind of from that you can get to the flow, the number per minute, at least a starting point for that. But sometimes we do have some discussions where in our world is a lot about the flow, right? So how many users per minute we are letting through from the queue, what we call outflow. But quite often when we're talking with customers or prospects, then they're more used to talk about number of transactions per minute. And that's, we need to be sure that, be careful that we're not comparing the two, right? Because um, one outflow, one user coming out of the queue, it can vary, right? Again, back to your say both the journey time, but also the number of transactions.
Yeah, and as we said, you may have a different metric in hand, and it's fine that that's what you have, but you just need to know, all right, so what does that mean and these other things? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And so kind of imagine, or maybe you can take us through a kind of a real example, right? But if there's a customer that comes to you and say, okay, I have this big event then that I'm expecting a peak of traffic, a big surge in 1 month. I mean, how is? I mean, do you have a specific playbook or some at least some guidance on how to start approaching that to get the highest confidence that that when you get to the event that you're ready?
Yeah, so the first advice is start earlier than you think. So if you think 1 month, no, start
Mm-hmm.
earlier. So because people often don't think about the full process, so they say, all right, I'll do the load testing and then I'll go live. But that's
Mm.
not really the process. The process is that you test and then you find the bottleneck and then you go back to development and say, no, we need to make some changes. And then you
Mm.
change something, or it could be something in the infrastructure, it could, and then you retest. And then,
Yeah.
so this cycle, you need to leave enough space for you. Otherwise, it's not, if you just know that this is my number, some people think, all right, what's my number? How many users can I support? And that's it. But it's not as beneficial as a process. You want to get to the optimal number. You want to say,
Mm.
so usually that's an iterative process where you test, refine, and test again.
Yeah.
So the more time you have, the more you can reap the benefits of it. So that's
And I
the
guess
first
it's
thing.
it can be, as you said, a long running game and with a lot of iterations because you do the first testing, you will find the first bottleneck, and then I guess if you're lucky or if you have the opportunity, you address that. Yeah, you lift that bottleneck, but then another one will show up, and then I guess
Yeah.
you could kind of follow up on that for quite a while and lifting a lot of the bottlenecks.
Yeah, correct. And the retesting part is super critical because,
Mm.
as we all know, in load testing, you fix one thing, you break something else, which is now much worse. So you
Yeah.
think it's going to get better, but
Ah.
it's not always like that. You can,
Mm.
you can, so definitely retest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And is there so is that's an interesting view, right? 'Cause- so is it often or perspective? So is it often that you lift a bottleneck and then actually you ended up creating another one that is actually has
Worse. Yeah.
lower throughput?
Yes.
Okay. So then in
It
those
could
cases, like,
happen.
oh, let's put the other bottleneck back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, it could happen. Again, because it's real life is not like that. It's not like a bottleneck to your limit. You change
Mm.
something in the code, and now it behaves differently, not always the way you expected. That's the
Yeah.
thing. It might be worse than you think. Yeah.
And we talked about, you mentioned database as the kind of the one clear suspect or kind of one of the usual suspects when kind of talked about bottlenecks. What are some, if they're like the top three or top five bottlenecks in complex systems? So if I fix the database
Yeah.
bottleneck, where would you expect the new bottlenecks to show up?
Yeah, it's hard for me to tell. It really depends on how your system is built. So I think the kind of the database is more for the like a big monolithic system that everybody depends on one system. That's where you're gonna see it. And now people are shifting to microservices. So you may not have, maybe your application is built out of many different small components. And there sometimes the problem is the orchestration between all of them. So each one of them is separate, it's doing its own thing, it's very good, but then eventually to do something complicated, you combine
Yeah.
all of them together, and then sometimes this is where things get to be a little bit more complicated. But every system is different.
And that's the kind of the orchestration component. That's interesting as well. We often we see, and we have also talked about kind of there's some external dependencies as well, being one of those cases, like either the payment gateways or some external API that you're calling. Does that relate with your experience as well?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a kind of it's a the tougher one to grapple with. Usually, you normally can't just record and load testing, and usually your partners would want to know when you're doing it.
Yeah, we know. We also like to know when our customers are doing load tests. So yeah,
exactly. So yeah, don't just use everything external and just run it. That's not really recommended.
No, but assuming that it's coordinated.
Yeah, but before we assume it, then yes, then it's kind of a thing that you do need to think about it. So I think your first priority is you. So I think if you can not go to these third-party items, if you can avoid using them and focus on the things that you can change, usually the conversation with partners is kind of different. It's not the same process as you go about. Yeah, it is something to think of because it could be your performance bottleneck. So you need to know who is in your ecosystem and how is their performance. But usually it's more of a conversation about SLA and what can you provide me. And it is sometimes if it's a critical part of your infrastructure to coordinate a load testing with them. But in many cases you can't. So you're using I don't know, Microsoft authentication. Many people do it. Then you don't really have a lot of control over these big giants to say, install new servers. So yeah. So it's more of you need to be aware of it, but it is a challenge.
And in practice, what do you say is the simplest way to address that? Is it with mock services that are just simulating the responses from those, or try to completely?
Yes. Yeah, it depends on what this thing is doing. If it's adding things, let's say you have ads that are popping up, but if you don't have them, they're not popping up, then probably the first thing I would try is just ignore it. So you can filter them out for the script and say, I don't need those ads in my script now. You have like a Facebook button or something like that, then you can just skip it. So the easiest part is to skip it for your test. But sometimes, for example, authentication, that's harder. That's a bigger one to tackle. So you can just skip it. The system won't work if you didn't log in. So you have to test it. And then either you mock it, you have something that says, bypass it. Let's say that I'm authenticated and you continue that for the testing, or you do coordinate it with the provider. Say, I need to do a little testing with the real thing.
I think it's a very good point to have the discussion of what is it exactly that you are load testing, right? That's a discussion that we also often have with our customers. Okay, you can load test us, but what is it that you want to achieve with that, right? Do you want to load test and understand your system and how much it can handle, or our system, right? And we do have some load tests that we can share with you to show how our system handles the load. And quite often there's kind of ways that our customers can load test their systems that do not require us. So it's a little bit, it's interesting that you're sharing that perspective, because I'm thinking about it kind of the other way as a provider, right? So
yes, you're definitely correct. And also it comes back to what we said at the beginning, that try to test simple and different component. So this is the same, I would say, mistake. If you test two completely different systems at the same time, maybe it's not the same. So maybe if you could, and you mostly can, avoid it. So make sure you test your own stuff first, know your bottlenecks, your scalability, know everything about you, and then see how does it fit with my other providers. If you try to do it all together, you kind of muddy the results for you. So if you start to be a little bit slower, but the other component working, but also a little bit slower, then it's harder to look at the results. You look at the results, this starts to be slower, but I don't know why.
You're adding too many variables to the equation, right? And then you don't know exactly.
If you can try to minimize it, yeah. And it is another thing. Just in our world, in the general world of testing, there is never an end for it. So how many unit tests can I have? Yeah, I can have. Just keep adding more and more things. So there's always. So here also start with the basics, and then eventually, maybe, or you have this big test that tests everything together, but only after you're comfortable with all the other components, you can say, all right, let's see that everything plays together. But if you start there, it's almost impossible to know what's next. Okay, so you see some numbers and you're stuck with them.
Yeah. And Yam, is there in kind of in your perspective, is there anything or kind of what is it that you see is changing these days in the kind of in the performance testing world, or specific with RadView? Does anything come to mind on kind of how the technology and the work is shifting?
So RadView, like the industry, like the world, is having this massive AI thing. So AI is definitely the biggest buzzword everywhere, and it's impacting the world, the industry, and us. So that's definitely the kind of biggest thing that's happening. We already have integration with AI, with the OpenAI ChatGPT. So when we show you the results, we can get kind of an AI opinion on the results, and it will kind of give you an explanation of, okay, your bottleneck starts after so and so users. That's what I'm seeing. So that's now, and and I'm seeing I'm seeing a future with many other things that are going to be more automated, smarter AI. That's one thing. But other things are happening in the industry also. For example, we see breaking up bigger applications into smaller microservices. So we see more of these API testings, which are, everything brings it a different flavor for the testing. But
would you say that API testing is easier to do than kind of a testing user journey, or
it's like what we said. It's easier because each API is more controlled, so each one of them is okay. But then the actual user journey is so many of them, and then the behavior of them together becomes tricky. But in some senses it is, because if there is a bottleneck, it's still easier to narrow it down to that smaller component rather than just looking at one big request and you say, all right, the whole thing takes so and so. So it's harder to know what's behind it. Yeah.
And you mentioned AI. The use case that you mentioned was kind of to help, I guess, interpret the results. Would you see that? Because I could imagine a use case where it would help you kind of validate / explore the user journey in the website. Is that something? Do you see any kind of future in that direction as well, or present? I don't know.
Well, we're working on it now, but I think all the areas where you have, and load testing still is, with everything we have, the current situation today, that is, you need some expertise to do load testing. So load testing still is not that easy. We have a tool, we try to help you, we do more and more of the work automated, but there's still a level of expertise that you need to understand. One of them is understanding the results. So you run it and you see graphs, you don't know what it is, it's a problem. But also, creating the user journey, validating it, comparing it to there are many areas that you still need help. And I'm seeing a future where AI is going to do more and more of these things, and it's going to be, you just said, all right, tell me how good is my website and
Yeah.
think about
Mm.
what are the
Yeah.
scenarios you should do. So all these steps eventually would be probably more and more automated.
Yeah. And the user journey is something that we also spend a lot of time looking at with our customers, right? Because if you're protecting your website or you want to protect a specific page, then of course, if you don't consider all the entry points to that page or to that resource, then you might be protecting one part. But if you forgot another entry, then it's not as good as it should be, right? So are we how confident are we that we have covered the full user journey? I think that's a hard problem, but it's I think a very interesting one as well. Good. And Yam, so just to wrap up, we like to bring a few rapid fire questions. So if just 3-4 questions, and the idea here is short answers, just whatever comes to mind. You just go. All right. I promise it's there's no trick questions. So I would start with for you, scalability is.
It's the ability to grow. It's not about how big you are; it's how fast can you grow. That would be focused on the thing that, yeah. What's blocking you from growing? Can you keep growing? And not can I reach 100 or 1,000, but can I keep growing? Yeah, it's not a number; it's a process. That's what I would think. Yeah.
Second question: is there a resource? So it could be, a book, a website, a blog, a specific person that you follow that you would recommend to our listeners?
Find something that's interesting for you. So I say don't focus on your exact niche, but look at a broader technology. Find somebody that they're like you like their voice. I speak Hebrew, so I wouldn't recommend you to hear my podcast. I'm hearing the Hebrew podcast about technology, but I think it gives you a broader view about what's happening in the world and not just always in your realm.
But you're welcome to share the name of that podcast as well. Maybe there are others that also speak Hebrew that would be interested.
Yeah, it's called Making Technology in Hebrew. Osim
Okay.
Technologia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. So in one recent episode, we've also had a suggestion for a podcast in Danish. So I think we will
Okay.
somehow at some
Yeah.
point cover all the languages with different podcasts. So that's
Yeah.
that's pretty
And
good.
I think my advice is not that this specific podcast is so great that you would want to translate it and hear it. You just find something that is easy for you. It's like
Yeah.
it's like easy reading, instead of going somewhere super deep in a very narrow location. Look at something which is it's almost like a pop culture kind of thing,
Nice.
but it still gives you a nice overview about what's happening in the world of technology. I think it's good.
Very good. Two more to go. What advice would you give to yourself early in your career? Or it could be to any listeners that are early in their career now.
I don't know. Be serious at what you do. Take it seriously. Think of you as a professional, even when you're small. Uh, you know, think of it. I'm not just a small cog in the system. I make a difference. I think, in tech industry, developers, every small one is doing something big. So you need to think about yourself as an
Nice.
important piece of the system.
And final question: which technology are you excited about these days? And there's an asterisk here. You're not allowed to say AI. So anything else in the technology world that that excites you, that you're looking forward to the next years?
So yeah, that's so the next, not the next, the previous one is
Mm,
everything about cloud containers and
mm,
all these thing. It's also on the other side of things. We still need to run things, and I think we have interesting technologies today that make it easier to build database that can scale
mm,
infinitely and machines that can orchestrate. And so all these worlds about it's not that new, but still interesting about
mm,
cloud containers and everything that you can much easily scale it up. It's interesting to note that even though technically it's infinite scalability, you can ask Amazon for infinite number of machines. What we've seen about, which was your important first questions about your scalability. So having more and more machines doesn't always translate to more and more throughput. That's why we talk about scalability. So the fact that you can reach a certain state and you can keep throwing it hardware doesn't always solve your problem. But if you build it correctly for scalability, then you can keep going. So, but it is very cool, the fact that you can just summon new machines on the fly. I still find it like magic. So that's pretty
like
cool.
magic, yeah, exactly. Awesome. And I think talking about this magical world, I think it's a good way to wrap up. So thank you so much, Yam, for dropping by the podcast. Really appreciate it, and it was great talking about load test and learn from your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you again for hosting me. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of the Smooth Scaling Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing and perhaps share it with a friend or colleague. If you want to share any thoughts or comments with us, send them to smoothscaling@qit.com. This podcast is researched by Joseph Thwaites, produced by Perseo Mandilo, and brought to you by Qit, your virtual waiting room partner. I'm your host, Jose Quaresma. Until next time, keep it smooth, keep it scalable.